How do 500,000 hardened soldiers simply stop fighting? April 18th, 1945, Western Germany. The war in Europe was all but over, yet here, in the heart of the Ruhr Valley, a final drama was unfolding that no one in the German High Command could comprehend. In a pocket of industrial cities and broken rivers, over 500,000 German soldiers, veterans who had fought from Stalingrad to Normandy, made a decision that would have been unthinkable only months before. They surrendered. Not in scattered units, not after being starved or annihilated, but en masse, entire divisions, corps, and armies, walking out of their defensive lines and laying down their weapons before the advancing Americans. To the outside world, it looked like the final collapse of a doomed army. But to those inside, to the men who had survived the Eastern Front, the desert, and the hedgerows of France, it was something more profound, something terrifying. Because what the Americans had unleashed in the Ruhr wasn't just superior firepower or overwhelming numbers. It was something far more systematic, something that made fighting itself seem irrational. Field Marshal Walter Model, commanding Army Group B, stood in his temporary headquarters near Duisburg, staring at maps that no longer made sense. 12 days earlier, American armored spearheads had done the impossible. They had closed a steel ring around his entire army group. More than 430,000 men, from hardened panzer veterans to rear echelon clerks, were trapped inside an area barely 50 miles wide. Model had seen encirclements before he'd broken them, survived them, even reversed them. But this one was different. There were no desperate breakout attempts, no fanatical last stands, no suicidally defiant counterattacks. Instead, there was only silence. Units stopped responding to orders. Commanders reported that men no longer believed in resistance. What the Americans had achieved in those days was not just a tactical victory, but a psychological collapse unprecedented in modern warfare. The Wehrmacht, once the master of lightning war and battlefield initiative, found itself paralyzed by something it could neither counter nor understand. The enemy no longer fought battles in the old sense. They engineered them. They didn't win through courage or maneuver. They won through integration, synchronization, and precision. The Germans had met their match not in another army, but in a system, and once that system surrounded them, there was no longer a decision to be made. Because resistance wasn't just futile, it was meaningless. The Americans had a name for it: vertical envelopment, a phrase as clinical as it was deceptive. Behind those two words hid a revolution in warfare, one that would mark the end of the heroic age of battle. Vertical envelopment meant more than air superiority, more than combined arms. It described a philosophy: the total integration of every dimension of war into a single, self-reinforcing system. A system so efficient, so comprehensive, that it didn't just destroy the enemy's capability to fight, it destroyed the reason to fight. The Germans had encountered encirclement before, at Stalingrad, at Falaise, in the fields of Ukraine, but they had always fought their way out, or died trying. Resistance, even in defeat, had meaning. In the Ruhr, meaning itself collapsed. Here, the Americans didn't fight a single, decisive battle. They engineered a condition of inevitability, a vast, mechanical tightening of the noose. Every hour that passed made resistance more pointless, more absurd. The collapse of Army Group B didn't begin with the first shots. It began the moment American command systems synchronized every part of their force, from logistics to air reconnaissance, into one rhythm of destruction. By 1945, the American military had become the first in history to operate as a machine intelligence, not in the modern digital sense, but as an analog organism of human will and industrial precision. Each element, armor, artillery, air power, supply, and command, functioned not as separate tools, but as organs in a living body. If a German column moved, reconnaissance aircraft saw it within hours. If a target appeared, artillery zeroed it before the Germans could react. If a defensive line formed, armor bypassed it before it mattered. No single American weapon won the Ruhr. The system did. And that system had no weaknesses the Germans could exploit. The Americans called their operational method synchronized warfare. To the Germans, it seemed supernatural. but it was simply method refined through 3 brutal years of learning, experimentation, and adaptation. It began in North Africa, where American units learned that courage and matériel meant nothing without coordination. It evolved through Italy and Normandy, where command networks learned to move information faster than German commanders could respond. And it reached perfection on the banks of the Rhine, where every bullet, bomb, and movement fit into a mathematically predictable flow of destruction. It wasn't about winning firefights. It was about controlling tempo. The faster side in war isn't the one that moves the quickest. It's the one that forces the enemy to always respond to yesterday's situation. And by April 1945, the Germans were fighting yesterday's war. To understand why it worked, you have to see what the system replaced. Before the Americans created this new model, war had been a test of skill, courage, and adaptability. Battles were fought by commanders reading the flow of events, seizing moments of opportunity. But in the industrial age, chance was the enemy. Unpredictability was inefficiency. The Americans built a structure that removed both. They didn't rely on genius. They relied on process. Every step from intelligence collection to supply movement followed a prearranged rhythm that allowed their armies to act faster than any individual mind could think. It wasn't brilliance. It was inevitability. For the soldiers of the Wehrmacht, this was incomprehensible. They had been taught that wars were won by bold initiative, the lightning strike, the daring maneuver, the brilliant local commander making instant decisions under fire. But in the Ruhr, initiative itself became a liability. German units that moved quickly were annihilated first. Those that held their ground were cut off, and those that waited for orders found themselves surrounded before their messages even reached headquarters. The Americans didn't simply outfight the Germans. They changed the definition of fighting. At the heart of this new warfare was tempo control. American Corps commanders like J. Lawton Collins had refined a principle learned through years of mistakes. The side that dictates pace dictates outcome. The Germans once owned that principle. Now, it belonged to the Americans. Their operational planning turned every engagement into a step in a self-reinforcing sequence. Each victory, however small, immediately triggered logistical and artillery shifts that enabled the next. Every enemy retreat opened corridors for armor exploitation. Every airstrike paved the ground for infantry advance. Each element built momentum for the others. Until German resistance wasn't broken by force, it was dissolved by process. This was what made the Ruhr Pocket more than a battle. It was a demonstration proof that the industrialized world had reached a new phase of warfare, one where victory was not achieved but manufactured. When German troops spoke of the American advance, they didn't describe it as a fight. They described it as a tide. It came with rhythm, pattern, and inevitability, an inhuman consistency that no courage could disrupt. By the time Model's staff realized the pocket had closed, American logistics were already prepared to feed, fuel, and rearm the spearheads for the next phase. Their trucks, painted with a single red circle, moved in endless lines across France and Belgium, bringing forward food, ammunition, and gasoline. They called it the Red Ball Express, a river of steel and fuel that kept the front in constant motion. To the Germans trapped in the Ruhr, it seemed infinite. To the Americans, it was Tuesday. That industrial rhythm had a psychological effect deeper than any weapon. When a German position was discovered, artillery followed within minutes. When artillery fell silent, aircraft appeared overhead. When air attacks ended, armor arrived. It was seamless, unstoppable, impersonal. There was no pause, no mercy, no breathing space. Every action triggered a reaction. Every reaction, another strike. The system didn't just destroy men. It destroyed meaning. In war, soldiers find comfort in cause and effect, courage leading to survival, skill leading to victory, leadership shaping fate. But in the Ruhr, none of those things held true anymore. Courage changed nothing. Leadership achieved nothing. Skill meant nothing, because the system had already calculated the outcome. The German High Command had no vocabulary for this kind of defeat. For them, the battlefield was a chessboard, the commander's art, the soldier's honor, the interplay of human will. The Americans weren't playing chess. They were running an algorithm, and, like any algorithm, Its goal was not glory, it was completion. To process every variable, neutralize every obstacle, and move on. The German soldiers trapped in the Ruhr didn't realize they were part of an experiment, one that would define warfare for the rest of the century. An experiment in total integration, where information, logistics, and firepower moved as one. The moment the circle closed, the outcome was already written. Historians would later look back at the Ruhr Pocket and call it the moment industrial warfare reached self-awareness, the point when the machine stopped serving the soldier and began replacing him. The system didn't need heroism. It didn't need improvisation. It didn't even need luck. It needed only inputs, movement, resistance, anything that could be measured, predicted, and neutralized. And for 500,000 German soldiers, every decision they made, every attempt to resist, to move, to fight, became one more data point in a machine that was already processing their defeat. When Field Marshal Model realized this truth, it shattered him. He had spent a lifetime mastering the art of war, adapting to the chaos of battle, reading terrain, sensing opportunity. Now, all of that was useless. The Americans had created a form of combat where no human could adapt fast enough, no instinct could compensate, no plan could surprise. Model's men still held the rifles, the tanks, the artillery, but the war itself had moved beyond them. They were fighting the past, and the past had already lost. The philosopher of war, Karl von Clausewitz, once wrote that war is the continuation of politics by other means. But by 1945, politics had nothing to do with it. War had become the continuation of industry. Factories, logistics, and synchronized systems had replaced ideology, leadership, and will. The Americans hadn't just built a fighting force. They had built a machine that could think faster, move farther, and destroy more efficiently than any individual ever could. And for the men trapped in the Ruhr, that realization came too late. Because once the system began to move, once it surrounded them, the war was already over. They just hadn't realized it yet. To understand the tragedy of the Ruhr, you have to go back to the beginning, to the philosophy that once made the German army the most feared force in the world. It began with a word, Auftragstaktik, mission command, a doctrine born from the Prussian obsession with initiative, the belief that war could not be managed from above, only guided. That victory came from the thinking soldier, the one who could act, decide, and adapt faster than anyone else on the battlefield. It was a doctrine forged in the chaos of Europe's past, the 7 Years' War, the Franco-Prussian War, the trenches of 1914, and by the time Hitler's armies crossed into Poland in 1939, it had become the engine of blitzkrieg, the lightning war that stunned the world. Under Auftragstaktik, every officer, from lieutenant to general, understood not just his orders, but the intent behind them. He was free to improvise, to exploit opportunity, to outthink the enemy. Discipline was not blind obedience. It was independence, shaped by purpose. In practice, this meant that a German company commander could seize initiative without waiting for permission. If communication broke down, he didn't stop, he decided. He acted. This made the Wehrmacht terrifyingly fast. Where others hesitated, Germans adapted. Where others sought orders, Germans sought opportunity. Their philosophy turned flexibility into a weapon. Their structure turned initiative into momentum. And for the first half of the war, it seemed unstoppable. From the Polish plains to the forests of France, from the deserts of North Africa to the fields of Ukraine, German commanders demonstrated a pattern the world had never seen. Small units achieving disproportionate results. Columns of tanks punching through entire armies. Commanders responding to chaos not with panic, but creativity. This was the golden age of Auftragstaktik, an era when a single decision by a captain or major could change the outcome of an entire campaign. Even Allied observers admitted grudging admiration. One British report from 1940 described the Wehrmacht as a body in which every nerve and limb acts as if it possessed its own intelligence. It wasn't just tactics, it was culture. Every German soldier, even the lowest private, was taught to think like a leader. They weren't cogs in a machine. They were the machine. This system of decentralized command worked brilliantly, but only under one condition: that war remained a contest of decisions, not systems. When both sides fought within the same tempo, human ingenuity could make the difference. When the battlefield still allowed for uncertainty, intuition mattered. But industrial warfare, especially American industrial warfare, began erasing that uncertainty, and the very strength of Auftragstaktik would become the Wehrmacht's undoing. By 1943, the warning signs were everywhere. At Kasserine Pass in North Africa, a few German battalions humiliated green American troops, using the same tactics that had conquered Europe. Their victory was swift, clinical, and complete. But the Americans learned. They studied the defeat like engineers studying a machine failure. Every weakness, communication, coordination, supply, doctrine was dissected and redesigned. Within a year, those same Americans had restructured their entire approach to battle. They didn't seek to imitate German initiative. They sought to neutralize it. Meanwhile, the Germans clung to their old faith. They believed tactical brilliance could offset strategic disadvantage, that better thinking and faster reacting would still win the day. They failed to see the scale of transformation happening across the Atlantic. For 5 years, the German army had lived by one rule: the better man wins. But by 1944, that rule no longer applied, because the Americans weren't trying to be better men. They were building a better system. Still, the Wehrmacht's reputation endured. Even in the war's final months, the myth of German superiority remained powerful. Their officers were veterans of the Eastern Front, men who had survived the inferno of Kursk, the siege of Kiev, the retreats through Poland. They had faced the Red Army's mass assaults, the endless Soviet artillery, and somehow prevailed again and again. They had seen death on a scale the Western Allies could scarcely imagine, and yet they had endured, because they believed in one unshakable truth: skill and willpower could always overcome material disadvantage. That belief became their religion, and like all faiths, it blinded them to the moment it stopped being true. The German army entered 1945, not as a rabble of broken men, but as a paradox, tactically brilliant, strategically doomed. Its doctrine still produced miracles on the battlefield, but those miracles no longer mattered. They could win engagements, but not outcomes. They could destroy tanks, but not momentum. They could outthink American battalions, but not outpace American logistics. The battlefield had changed. It was no longer a chessboard of moves and countermoves. It was a conveyor belt, and no matter how skilled the players, the belt kept moving. In Germany's military academies, Auftragstaktik had been celebrated as the highest form of command, the art of thinking soldiers. But by 1945, thinking itself had become the enemy. Every decision a German commander made, the Americans had already accounted for. Every maneuver he attempted, they had the resources to counter. It wasn't that German officers had forgotten how to fight. It was that their fighting no longer mattered. Field Marshal Model, the man now trapped in the Ruhr, was himself the embodiment of Auftragstaktik. He was called the Führer's fireman, the commander sent to rescue impossible fronts. He was pragmatic, decisive, and fiercely independent. For years, his ability to act without hesitation had saved armies from disaster. But now, as he watched his forces encircled, he was facing something that no instinct or experience could overcome. He could still command. He could still think. But the battlefield was no longer listening. The tragedy was that the Germans didn't lose their doctrine. They perfected it. Even in the Ruhr, their defensive preparations were works of art. Every bridge was wired for demolition. Every road intersection pre-registered for artillery fire. Every factory complex turned into a fortress. On paper, it was flawless, the culmination of 6 years of hard-earned tactical genius. Every rule of defensive warfare, every principle of flexibility and initiative had been obeyed. But those rules belonged to another era, because the Americans weren't coming to fight a battle. They were coming to execute a process. And no amount of tactical excellence could withstand a process designed to eliminate the very concept of decision-making. German soldiers thought they were preparing to defend ground. In truth, they were preparing their own containment. Every fortified position, every carefully placed gun, every fallback trench, all of it became markers on a map that the Americans would soon use to calculate the pace of destruction. The Germans believed they had built fortresses. They had built coordinates. By early April, as Model's staff began reporting the American advance from the west and south, their reactions followed the old logic. They planned counterattacks. They shifted reserves. They reorganized supply routes. Each time they acted, the Americans were already there, cutting roads, isolating units, anticipating movement. German doctrine taught that initiative was everything, but initiative now only hastened defeat. Every movement created new data for the system to exploit. What had once been flexibility had become predictability. For the German soldiers trapped in the Ruhr, it was a slow realization. At first, they believed it was bad luck, unlucky artillery, overwhelming air power, coordination they couldn't match. But as days passed, that illusion faded. They saw a pattern, the precision, the timing, the inevitability. No matter what they did, the result was the same. They were encircled again, cut off again. Attacked at the precise moment they moved. They weren't being defeated by men. They were being defeated by design. And in that realization lay the cruel irony of the German army's downfall. They had built the most adaptive, intelligent, and flexible fighting force in modern history. But they had entered an era where adaptability no longer mattered because the environment itself had been engineered to predict and nullify it. In the Ruhr, the proud legacy of Auftragstaktik of the thinking soldier, the independent commander, the genius tactician came to its end. They hadn't been outsmarted. They had been out-evolved. In February 1943, in the barren hills of Tunisia, American soldiers learned a lesson that would reshape the future of warfare. At a place called Kasserine Pass, a handful of German panzer units under Erwin Rommel shattered the first major U.S. offensive in North Africa. It was a rout. Tanks abandoned, positions overrun, units scattered in confusion. The Americans had entered the war with confidence, believing industrial strength, courage, and moral purpose would carry them to victory. But Kasserine taught them a brutal truth. War was not about courage. It was about systems. When the reports reached Eisenhower's headquarters, they made for grim reading. American units had been poorly coordinated. Communications collapsed. Artillery support lagged hours behind requests. Tanks attacked piecemeal without reconnaissance. Infantry and armor fought as separate worlds. Against Rommel's veterans, hardened by 3 years of war, it was chaos versus cohesion. Rommel later wrote with cold admiration, "The Americans are brave, but their bravery is uncoordinated." It was true. The U.S. Army didn't lack heart, it lacked structure. That defeat sparked a transformation unlike anything in military history. Eisenhower didn't just replace generals. He rewired the way the United States thought about war itself. Training programs were overhauled. Doctrine was rewritten. Technology, logistics, and intelligence were fused into a single operational architecture. The Americans realized something profound. Victory in modern war didn't belong to the most courageous or the most brilliant. It belonged to the side that could make the fewest mistakes the fastest. And the only way to do that was through systems. The rebuilding began with communication. In the desert of North Africa, radios had failed. By Normandy, every platoon leader carried one. Information, not bravery, would become the decisive weapon. Then came coordination. Armor, infantry, and artillery were no longer separate branches. They were synchronized instruments of a single design, each operating within defined rhythms that allowed them to anticipate each other without direct orders. Commanders were retrained to think in terms of phases and tempo, not mere geography. The goal was no longer to win battles. The goal was to control time. Behind it all lay an American advantage that no enemy could replicate: logistics. By 1944, the U.S. had achieved the impossible: a global supply chain feeding millions of men across 3 continents. Every bullet, every meal, every drop of fuel was tracked, scheduled, and delivered by an industrial process with the precision of a production line. Factories in Detroit, Pittsburgh, and Seattle weren't just building tanks, they were building momentum. And momentum, once created, became self-sustaining. The most dramatic example was the Red Ball Express, the lifeline that fed the advance from Normandy to the Rhine. It was a continuous convoy system, trucks running 24 hours a day, painted with a red circle that allowed them priority on every road in France. Between August and November 1944, they delivered over 400,000 tons of supplies. Fuel, ammunition, rations, a rolling artery of steel and gasoline. The Germans saw American tanks as unstoppable. But those tanks were only the visible tip of an invisible machine, a logistics empire that turned industrial power into battlefield inevitability. Rommel's Afrika Korps had lived day to day, supply to supply. The Americans fought with a warehouse behind every rifle. Yet logistics alone didn't win the war. It was what the Americans did with that logistics that changed history. They transformed supply into strategy. Every advance was planned not around enemy weakness, but around the flow of material. Wherever the trucks could go, victory followed. By early 1945, the front itself had become a moving factory, steel, fuel, and ammunition flowing with the predictability of an assembly line. If a unit took losses, replacements arrived within days. If artillery fired all its shells, resupply came within hours. The Germans fought battles. The Americans ran operations. That distinction mattered because by 1945, operations had become the new language of war. Whereas German commanders thought in terms of divisions and terrain, American planners thought in terms of sequences and synchronization. A division wasn't just a fighting force, it was a cog in a vast operational process. Its job wasn't to hold or take ground, it was to keep the process running, and the process never stopped. This shift in thinking was led by a new generation of American commanders. Men like J. Lawton Collins, Omar Bradley, and George Patton, each very different in temperament, but united by one idea: war could be systematized. Collins, commanding VF Corps, became the architect of what he called predictive warfare. His staff calculated enemy movements not by guesswork, but by pattern using data from reconnaissance, intercepted communications, and even road networks to anticipate where the Germans would be next. Patton, for all his flamboyance, was the ultimate system operator. He didn't just move fast, he moved predictably fast, fast enough that his logistics teams could preempt him, and Bradley, calm and deliberate, oversaw it all like a conductor managing a symphony of destruction. By the time the Allies crossed the Rhine, the transformation was complete. The U.S. Army no longer resembled the force that had fled Kasserine 2 years earlier. It was an industrial organism, each part feeding, reinforcing, and protecting the others. When a German position was identified, the system responded almost automatically. Reconnaissance aircraft photographed it. Within hours, artillery maps were updated. Then came fighter bombers, then tanks, then infantry. Every phase had a timeline. Every phase had redundancy. If one failed, another filled the gap. The Germans tried to interpret these patterns as strategy. They weren't. They were procedure. To the American soldier, this meant predictability and confidence. To the German soldier, it meant despair. For every move they made, the Americans had a pre-programmed response, immediate, overwhelming, and precise. It wasn't luck. It was design. The system didn't need to improvise because it had already anticipated every possible variable. In the words of one German officer captured near Cologne, "They do not fight us, they process us." The difference in command philosophy was stark. The Wehrmacht prized initiative officers thinking for themselves, seizing moments of opportunity. The Americans prized reliability officers, ensuring that no matter what, the machine kept moving. It wasn't as glamorous, but it worked. For the Americans, war had become logistics wrapped in firepower, and the rhythm of that system was unstoppable. Every advance calculated, every pause predetermined, every engagement designed to sustain the tempo without risk. Even when mistakes happened, and they did, the system absorbed them. A lost company didn't break a line. It triggered a protocol. A destroyed tank column didn't halt an attack. It initiated reinforcement procedures. War had been mechanized not just in weapons, but in thought. By early April 1945, as the Ruhr operation began, American field commanders weren't planning battles anymore. They were running programs. The closing of the pocket was less a military decision than an inevitable result of the system's momentum. Reconnaissance data dictated movement. Supply capacity determined objectives. Artillery schedules shaped attacks. When Model's armies found themselves surrounded, it wasn't because of one brilliant maneuver. It was because every possible path had been mathematically sealed. That was the true genius of the American transformation. They had turned complexity into predictability, and predictability into inevitability. In a sense, the Ruhr was not a battle at all. It was an audit, a calculation of what happened when human initiative met industrial process. The Germans brought courage, discipline, and tactical brilliance. The Americans brought an equation. And in the industrial age, the equation always wins. Eisenhower later reflected that the greatest victory of the Western Front wasn't Normandy, or the Bulge, or even the crossing of the Rhine. It was the system itself, the invisible network of men, machines, and schedules that turned chaos into order. He wrote, "The success of our armies lies not in any single battle, but in the organization that allowed every battle to be fought the same way, efficiently, predictably, and successfully." That was the legacy of America's transformation, not a single triumph of arms, but the creation of a self-sustaining rhythm of victory. By the time the Ruhr Pocket closed, the transformation was complete. The Americans were no longer adapting to the war. The war was adapting to them. The lessons of Kasserine had evolved into a doctrine that made defeat impossible not through heroism, but through inevitability. For the German commanders still clinging to the ideals of initiative and improvisation, it was incomprehensible. They were fighting an opponent who didn't fight back in the traditional sense. An opponent who simply advanced, absorbed, adjusted, and kept going. The US Army had become the first truly industrial organism in human history, a weapon of process, not passion. And in April 1945, that organism reached its moment of perfection. April 4th, 1945. Eastern bank of the Rhine River, Lippe sector. At precisely 0600 hours, the circle closed. In just 12 days of relentless movement, two American armies, the 1st and 9th, had executed a maneuver the German staff considered operationally impossible. They had achieved the complete encirclement of Army Group B, over 430,000 men in total, including combat troops, supply personnel, engineers, and stragglers. The Ruhr Valley, the industrial heart of Germany, had become a cage. From the air, the scene looked like a map come alive. Columns of American armor snaked along highways once used to deliver coal and steel to the Reich. Now, those same roads carried the instruments of its destruction. At the center of it all lay a tangle of rivers, the Rhine to the west, the Ruhr to the south, the Lippe cutting through the middle, and between them a maze of cities. Essen, Dortmund, Bochum, Duisburg. Factories, smokestacks, rail yards, canals. It was a region built for production. Now, it would become a perfect trap. For the Germans inside, the news hit like a thunderclap. At first, many didn't believe it. They'd survived encirclements before. Stalingrad had fallen, yes, but countless smaller pockets had been broken open by swift counterattacks. Surely this would be the same. Surely Model, the Führer's fireman, would find a way. In the early hours of April 5th, Model's staff convened at a small farmhouse outside Duisburg. Maps covered the walls, radio chatter filled the room. The reports were grim. American armored columns advancing from both north and south, bridgeheads firmly secured, crossings over the Rhine expanding by the hour. The encirclement was real, and it was tightening. Still, the German officers refused to panic. If they had learned anything from 5 years of war, it was that prepared defenses could blunt even the strongest attack. And the Ruhr was a fortress by nature. It was one of the most heavily industrialized regions on Earth. Dense urban terrain, fortified factories, labyrinthine mines, and natural barriers of water and steel. Rivers and canals cut the land into natural choke points. The terrain was ideal for defense, so they prepared to fight. Under Model's direction, General Gunther Blumentritt and Lieutenant General Fritz Bayerlein began converting the entire valley into a defensive grid. Every bridge was wired for demolition. Every street intersection registered for artillery. Every open field mined and covered by machine gun nests. The engineers turned factories into bunkers. Steel foundries became fortresses. Coal shafts became command posts. On paper, it was the culmination of 6 years of German tactical evolution, the perfect synthesis of experience from every front of the war. To their minds, the Ruhr could become another Sevastopol, another Monte Cassino, a bastion that would bleed the enemy dry. They had ammunition for weeks of fighting, rations for 2, medical facilities hidden underground, communication lines buried under concrete and steel. For the first time in months, many of the officers felt something dangerously close to confidence. Colonel Wilhelm Wibbig of the 15th Army wrote in his diary that evening, "The Americans will find the Ruhr is not France. Here they will meet prepared men. Here, their speed means nothing." He wasn't boasting, he was reciting doctrine. The German defense manual stated it clearly. Properly prepared positions can inflict 3 to 5 times the casualties on any attacker. Even if the Americans had 3-to-1 superiority, the math still worked in Germany's favor. At least, that's what the manuals said. But manuals couldn't describe what was coming, because the Americans weren't approaching the Ruhr as a battlefield. They were approaching it as a process. They weren't seeking decisive engagements or glory. They were seeking completion, the efficient reduction of a trapped force through systematic disintegration. For them, the Ruhr was not a fight. It was a logistical problem to be solved. From the outside, the encirclement looked simple. 2 pincers closing around a trapped army. But inside the cage, the Germans experienced something surreal. Every movement they made, every attempt to reposition, every column that tried to retreat seemed to trigger a response from the sky or the ground. Convoys disappeared under artillery fire. Reinforcements never arrived. Bridges destroyed in the morning were already bypassed by American engineers by afternoon. It was as if the enemy could see everything, as if they were watching from above, and in truth, they were. American reconnaissance planes, flying in precise grid patterns, photographed every square mile of the Ruhr Pocket. Each mission delivered film to tactical headquarters within 2 hours. Every movement was plotted. Every road updated on new maps, printed daily for the advancing units. The Americans had turned the entire battlefield into a living dataset, one that evolved faster than German command could react. On April 6th, the first major counterattack was launched. Elements of the 116th Panzer Division and remnants of the 2nd Parachute Corps tried to break west toward Wesel. They never reached the halfway point. Artillery destroyed their staging areas before the tanks could even move. Those who did advance ran headlong into columns of American Shermans that had already repositioned hours earlier based on reconnaissance patterns. It wasn't luck. It was the system reacting faster than the Germans could think. By nightfall, the survivors fell back, convinced the Americans must have had spies in their ranks. But the truth was worse. The Americans didn't need spies. They had process. In the days that followed, smaller German units tried to slip through gaps in the encirclement. Each was intercepted with uncanny timing. Roads thought to be open were already blocked. Crossings assumed unguarded were mined or under direct fire. It became clear to everyone from privates to generals that this wasn't ordinary war anymore. They were fighting something invisible, something calculated. Still, Field Marshal Model refused to surrender. He believed in local initiative, in the possibility of surprise, of seizing an unexpected moment. He told his staff, "As long as men still fight, a way can be found." But even his optimism was fading. Every time he ordered a breakout, communications failed. Every time he requested fuel or ammunition, the convoys vanished. Every time he moved his headquarters, American artillery zeroed the new coordinates within hours. It was as if the enemy was reading his mind. On April 8th, Model toured the front lines by car. He passed through shattered towns, once industrial powerhouses, now grey wastelands of concrete and twisted metal. Civilians wandered aimlessly. Soldiers, dirty and exhausted, dug trenches in factory courtyards. He asked one officer how morale was. The man hesitated before replying, "My men will fight, but they ask why." That night, Model didn't answer. He simply stared at his maps, at the endless red arrows converging on every possible exit. The Ruhr Pocket wasn't collapsing because of lack of courage or leadership. It was collapsing because there was no longer a point. Every defense line became meaningless within hours. Every fallback position was already under observation. Every message to headquarters was intercepted or rendered obsolete before arrival. The Germans were fighting inside a closed circuit, a loop designed by someone who had already predicted the outcome. The fortress they had built to protect themselves had become a cage. By April 10th, reports flooded in of entire battalions surrendering without orders. Units that had fought on the Eastern Front, that had survived Kursk and Kharkov, simply walked out of their positions with white flags. General Harold von Elverfeldt, commanding the 9th Panzer Division, recorded in his final report, "Every move draws immediate fire. Every concentration draws air attack. We advance 500 meters and are encircled. We cannot maneuver. We can only die in place or surrender." He surrendered 3 days later with 38 operational tanks still intact and ammunition for 2 more days of combat. When interrogated, he said, "I did not surrender because I was defeated. I surrendered because fighting had become murder." By mid-April, the once proud Army Group B had disintegrated into fragments, disconnected divisions, isolated pockets, and wandering groups of stragglers. American units advancing from east and west met with little resistance. Entire towns surrendered on sight. The process had become mechanical. U.S. commanders even created prisoner processing stations along the front assembly line facilities, designed to handle tens of thousands of captives per day. German soldiers were disarmed, documented, given food and water, and moved to rear camps in less than 12 hours. It was surrender at scale, mass capitulation managed with the same precision as a logistics operation. On April 17th, Field Marshal Model finally accepted reality. He issued his last order. Commanders may surrender if further resistance serves no purpose. It was a quiet dissolution of an entire army group. He refused to surrender himself. A week later, he walked into a forest near Duisburg and took his own life. He left no note, only a final remark to his adjutant. A field marshal does not surrender, but his soldiers already had, not because they lacked courage, but because they understood the truth. They had not been defeated in battle. They had been rendered irrelevant. When the fighting ended, the numbers were staggering. Over 325,000 prisoners processed. Estimates suggested nearly 500,000 captured across the region, when including auxiliary and support units. American casualties during the entire operation, fewer than 12,000. German casualties, about the same, but the rest had simply laid down their arms. In the calculus of warfare, such ratios were impossible. But then, this hadn't been a war of ratios. It had been a demonstration of what happens when human will meets industrial inevitability. The Ruhr Pocket was not the last battle of the war, but it was the last that mattered. It marked the end of a century of military tradition, the moment when courage, ingenuity, and tactical brilliance were overruled by integration, tempo, and process. The Germans had entered the pocket, believing they were fighting the old war, the war of decisions, of leadership, of human will. But they were wrong. The Americans weren't playing the same game. They weren't fighting battles. They were conducting operations. And operations don't have heroes. They have results. At 8:30 hours on April 5th, 1945, the machine began to move. Over the Ruhr, the morning fog lifted to reveal a sky filled with the silver glint of reconnaissance aircraft P-38 Lightnings and F-5 photoplanes flying in perfectly timed grid patterns. They didn't hunt for targets. They recorded everything. Every field, every road, every smoke column, every moving vehicle. Each plane carried cameras calibrated to cover exact sectors. Each flight was numbered and logged. Within 2 hours, the film from those missions was on the desks of analysts at IX Tactical Air Command headquarters. By midday, their interpreters had mapped the latest German troop movements, bridge demolitions, and fuel depots. It was not reconnaissance as support, it was reconnaissance as system input. And that was the key. The Americans didn't wait for information. They scheduled it. Every grid was photographed at regular intervals. every image cross-checked with ground reports and artillery spotting. From these constant snapshots, analysts built a dynamic model of the entire Ruhr Pocket, not a map frozen in time, but a living diagram that changed hour by hour. At 1,400 hours that same day, the first pattern emerged. German convoys shifting east to reinforce the Hamsoest line. Within minutes, coordinates were passed to corps artillery. At 1,600 hours, the guns opened fire, but not at the convoys themselves. They struck the intersections the convoys would reach in 30 minutes, based on observed average speeds from earlier reconnaissance. To the Germans, it felt like clairvoyance. To the Americans, it was simple mathematics. Every new photograph updated the equation. Every German movement, every response, created more data. The system began to anticipate, adapt, and refine not through artificial intelligence, but through an almost mechanical rhythm of observation, calculation, and action. Colonel Edwin Bull, Luther, Chief of Artillery for 7th Corps, had spent 2 years perfecting the time-on-target method. His rule was simple. All shells from all batteries should land at the same second. A target would hear 1 or 2 ranging shots, and then nothing. A minute later, dozens of shells from 6 directions arrived simultaneously, detonating within a 5-second window. The Germans never knew what hit them. By the time they tried to relocate, the next salvo had already been plotted. The system didn't allow for reaction. It erased the very concept of response. The scale was staggering. An American armored division advanced with more attached artillery than the entire German corps opposing it, and that was before corps-level and army-level fire was added. When the 7th Corps called for full support, over 300 guns answered, each linked by radio, each synchronized by clock to within seconds. The Germans had roughly 800 artillery pieces in the pocket, but fuel shortages and constant counter-battery fire meant that fewer than 200 could operate at any given moment. Their defensive doctrine assumed a ratio of 3 attacking guns for every defending one. In reality, it was 15-1. There was no countermeasure for that, yet artillery was only the anvil. The hammer was tempo. American armored columns didn't attack strongpoints. They bypassed them. They advanced along roads chosen not for geography but for logistical sustainability. If a town was too heavily defended, it was isolated, not stormed. Within hours, its defenders were surrounded and forgotten. Lieutenant General William Simpson, commanding the 9th Army, described it bluntly. "We don't take towns. We cut them off and let their defenders become prisoners of the timetable." Every German strongpoint slowed itself by existing. Every delay shortened its lifespan. Communications made it all possible. In 1943, a U.S. Corps headquarters might take a day to transmit a full artillery plan. By 1945, radio coordination reduced that to under an hour. Tank commanders had direct lines to air controllers orbiting overhead. Infantry officers could call in artillery with handheld radios, a luxury unheard of at the war's start. It wasn't superior leadership. It was bandwidth. And bandwidth won wars. By April 7th, the system was fully operational. Each day began with a briefing cycle. Aerial reconnaissance reports at 0600. Updates from forward observers by 0800. Artillery allocations by 0900. Armored columns moved at 1,000, with logistical convoys following precisely 4 hours behind. Night operations focused on road clearance, bridge repair, and prisoner processing. Every task, every unit, every function had its place in a rhythm that repeated daily. To an outside observer, it might have seemed mundane, mechanical even. To those trapped inside the Ruhr, it was suffocating perfection. No mistakes, no hesitation, just inevitability. The Germans, still guided by doctrine that prized flexibility, couldn't comprehend the relentlessness. They were used to opponents who attacked, paused, reorganized, then attacked again. The Americans didn't pause. When one division stopped, another took its place. When supplies ran low, the Red Ball Express convoys arrived overnight. When weather grounded planes, artillery compensated with pre-planned barrages. There was no weakness to exploit because the system had built redundancy into every layer. For every delay, there was an alternate. For every contingency, a pre-written solution. It wasn't improvisation. It was inevitability by design. By April 9th, German intelligence reports began using the same word again and again. Unheimlich, uncanny. American fire arrived where troops would move. Air strikes hit bridges that German engineers hadn't finished repairing. Even night convoys were ambushed by fighter bombers guided by radar and pathfinder flares. A lieutenant from the 116th Panzer Division wrote in his journal, "It is as if they can read our orders before we send them. Every road we choose becomes the wrong one." The truth was simpler. American command had built the closest thing to real-time warfare the 1,940 seconds could produce. Their operations rooms, large canvas tents lined with maps, looked nothing like German headquarters filled with paper dispatches. Each U.S. map was a living instrument. Colored pins for armor, transparent overlays for artillery zones, strings connecting supply lines. Officers moved markers every hour based on new reconnaissance photos. The battlefield became an interactive dashboard, and that interactivity turned planning into prediction. By mid-April, the tempo became unbearable for the defenders. German staff officers couldn't issue orders fast enough. By the time a plan reached the front, it was obsolete. Lieutenant Karl Godem of the 116th Panzer Division summarized the frustration. "We make the right decisions for situations that no longer exist." He wasn't exaggerating. Each German order was trapped in a lag of time, a delay the Americans had engineered intentionally. They didn't need to outmaneuver the Germans on the map. They only had to move faster in time. That was the true battlefield of 1945, not geography, but chronology. Even the human rhythm of combat had been industrialized. Where the Germans still relied on intuition, the Americans relied on scheduling. Where the Germans saw opportunity, the Americans saw data. A typical engagement lasted 6 hours. The first hour artillery preparation, the next 2 hours armored breakthrough, then consolidation and resupply by hour 6. It was predictable, yes, but predictability itself became a weapon. German defenders, expecting pauses, launched counterattacks into pre-registered kill zones. Every reaction had already been accounted for. Air power completed the circuit. Tactical bombers no longer hunted for targets independently. They followed the same operational rhythm as artillery synchronized by radio with ground advances. At 0900, P-47, Thunderbolt struck supply convoys. At 1100, medium bombers hit bridges. By 1300, armored divisions exploited the gaps. Everything operated on the same clock, an industrial metronome ticking across the entire Western Front. The effect on German morale was devastating. Psychiatrists in American POW camps later noted that many captured soldiers described the experience not as defeat, but as extermination of agency. They hadn't been outfought, they had been out-timed. One sergeant told interrogators, "With the Russians, a brave man might change something. With the Americans, bravery just means you die for nothing." The Germans were facing not a human enemy, but the mechanization of inevitability. By April 12th, this rhythm reached full synchronization. Every branch, air, armor, artillery, logistics, operated like gears in a clock. When one German strongpoint was neutralized, the artillery batteries automatically shifted to the next. Supply trucks rerouted in real time. Reconnaissance aircraft adjusted flight patterns to new priorities. The entire process ran without a single overarching genius. No Rommel, no Guderian, no Napoleon, just thousands of men following procedure together, perfectly. It was democracy turned into doctrine, collective precision replacing individual brilliance. The Germans tried to break the tempo by forcing chaos, night raids, sabotage, deception. None of it worked. American units simply absorbed the disturbances. If a bridge blew, engineers replaced it within 12 hours. If supply routes were cut, alternate ones activated. The system had achieved what every general in history had dreamed of: resilience through process. In the final week before collapse, the Ruhr became a laboratory of inevitability. Every German choice to fight, to retreat, to hide, only fed the system's predictive loop. The Americans learned from each encounter refined their models, and shortened their reaction times. By April 14th, the response cycle from detection to destruction had dropped to less than 3 hours. Against that speed, Auftragstaktik, the German doctrine of independent initiative, was meaningless. Freedom of action without freedom of time was suicide. That was when the psychological collapse began. It wasn't terror. It was futility. Officers stopped issuing complex orders because they knew no plan could survive the tempo. Soldiers began surrendering not out of fear, but out of logic. There was simply no advantage in continuing. They had realized what Model himself had come to suspect, that the Americans had built a weapon beyond weapons, a meta-weapon, a design for how to make human resistance functionally impossible. One historian would later describe it perfectly. The Americans industrialized operational tempo. They made time itself their ally, and rendered human ingenuity obsolete. That is why the Ruhr Pocket remains more than a historical footnote. It was the first demonstration of predictive warfare as system, not struggle. When the last German formations laid down their arms on April 21st, the system didn't even slow. Convoys shifted to prisoner transport. Ammunition dumps became food depots. Communication lines redirected to new operations eastward. Victory required no celebration. The process simply continued. To the Americans, it was efficiency. To the Germans, it was annihilation without blood. For the men who witnessed it, the memory was haunting. One American officer wrote in his diary, "We didn't defeat them in the field. We surrounded them with process." A German lieutenant, captured near Essen, said it differently. "They made thinking useless." And perhaps that was the truest description of all. Because by April 1945, the system had reached its ultimate goal, the elimination of unpredictability. War had become calculation, and calculation had become destiny. By mid-April 1945, the noise of battle inside the Ruhr began to fade, replaced by something unfamiliar, quiet. The shelling still thundered, aircraft still prowled the skies, yet the fighting spirit that had carried the Wehrmacht across a continent was gone. Men fought mechanically, not passionately. Orders were obeyed out of habit, not conviction. The Germans were not simply losing, they were emptying out. Across the valley, units reported the same pattern. A company would resist for a few hours, then stop firing. Squads would retreat without panic, then sit together in silence, waiting. Sometimes they stacked their rifles neatly before walking toward American lines, hands raised. The first American patrols who met these groups were bewildered. There had been no white flags, no negotiations, just men standing on roadsides, exhausted, ready to be processed. Major Robert H. McAllister of the 79th Infantry Division recalled, "They didn't act beaten. They acted detached like spectators who had decided the show was over. The shift wasn't about fear. These were veterans of Stalingrad, Kursk, Normandy men who had survived annihilation and returned to fight again. They weren't afraid of dying. They were afraid of meaninglessness. Against the Soviets, courage still mattered. A brave act could save comrades, delay an advance, earn a name. Against the Americans, bravery achieved nothing. The outcome didn't change, only the body count did. That realization spread faster than panic ever could. It wasn't contagion, it was clarity. American interrogators later called it the rational surrender. Captured soldiers spoke with calm precision about why they had stopped fighting. One sergeant said, "We knew exactly what would happen if we fired artillery in 5 minutes, air attack in 10, tanks in 30. Nothing we did could interrupt that schedule. So why die on schedule?" Another prisoner explained, "It wasn't defeat. It was mathematics." In makeshift field hospitals, German doctors treated the wounded under a new kind of despair. They no longer talked about holding out or counterattacks. They discussed logistics, the shortage of morphine, the absence of ambulances, the impossibility of evacuation. War had lost its vocabulary of hope. Chaplain Franz Schneider wrote in a letter later recovered from his belongings, "I walk among the men and hear no hatred, no rage, only the sound of reckoning. They speak as accountants of their own destruction." Meanwhile, American lines continued to move with mechanical grace. The 2nd Armored Division advanced 15 kilometers in a single day without encountering organized resistance. Engineers followed immediately, clearing mines and opening supply routes. Prisoner columns stretched for miles. Even surrender had become part of the system, a process managed with forms, rations, and efficiency. To the German soldiers walking west, that efficiency was more terrifying than any weapon. It proved the enemy could manage their defeat better than they could manage their own existence. For Field Marshal Model, the realization came too late. Reports arriving at his headquarters painted a picture not of battle but of dissolution. Entire divisions no longer answered their radios. Corps staffs disappeared. Liaison officers surrendered on arrival. He refused to believe it at first, calling it temporary confusion. But when his chief of staff placed the latest prisoner estimates before him, over 150,000 by April 15th, Model simply nodded and said nothing. That evening he told a subordinate, "Our men have ceased to believe in resistance. That is a weapon we never taught them to use." American intelligence officers monitoring German radio traffic noticed the change too. Early in the campaign, intercepts had been filled with crisp tactical orders, artillery corrections, counterattack plans, fuel requests. By mid-April, transmissions were short, fragmented, almost conversational fragments of disbelief. "Do you still hold Essen?" one operator asked. The reply came, "We hold the idea of Essen." At night, the valley glowed with fires from burning factories, and the flicker of thousands of small campfires not for cooking, but for warmth among men waiting to surrender at dawn. When American patrols approached, the Germans rarely resisted. Some saluted before laying down their weapons. Others simply stared, as if watching the inevitable become real. Corporal James Rooney, who helped process prisoners near Dortmund, wrote in his journal, "They didn't seem broken. They seemed unplugged." Psychologists later studying those surrendering units coined a term for it, operational fatigue collapse. But it wasn't fatigue in the ordinary sense. It was the moment when human consciousness recognized its irrelevance within a machine that no longer required it. These men weren't defeated. They were outdated. As April 16th dawned, the system no longer needed to advance. The pocket collapsed on its own. American patrols reported thousands of Germans walking toward their lines without coordination. Entire divisions ceased to exist, not through destruction but through disintegration, soldiers melting into the flow of surrender. The U.S. First Army established dedicated processing corridors, guiding men with white markers and signs written in German, "This way to safety. Lay down your arms." It was surrender on an industrial scale. Each station operated like a factory floor. First table, weapons collected. Second, identification recorded. Third, rations and medical checks. Fourth, transport to the rear. Within 24 hours, more than 50,000 men passed through these stations. By April 18th, the total exceeded 325,000. The machinery of war had transformed seamlessly into the machinery of peacekeeping. The same logistics that had delivered artillery shells now delivered bread and cigarettes. Even their surrender was processed by the system. Among the prisoners, discipline collapsed differently than it had during combat. There were no mutinies, no chaos, no riots. Instead, there was a strange calm, the quiet of men who had accepted their obsolescence. A captured officer from the 3rd Panzer Grenadier Division told his interrogators, "When you are inside the system, you stop asking what is right or wrong. You only ask what comes next." That sentiment echoed through hundreds of interviews. The men didn't feel conquered. They felt processed. Even the Americans began to sense the strangeness of it. Captain Alan Rosenthal wrote to his wife, "We take them in by the thousands. They march like commuters at the end of a workday. Nobody curses. Nobody cheers. It's as if the war has simply switched off." For the first time in history, a major army had surrendered not from collapse, starvation, or terror, but from recognition. They understood they no longer existed as meaningful participants in the war. Meanwhile, Field Marshal Model's world had shrunk to the size of a map table. Reports of new surrenders came hourly. Headquarters staff abandoned their posts. Even his driver begged him to flee east. But Model refused. He had once said, A field marshal does not surrender. Now those words had become a prison. He still believed in duty, in the chain of command, in personal honor concepts, forged in an era when will could still shape outcomes. But that era was gone. He was a man of instincts, trapped in a world that no longer required them. On April 17th, he drafted his final order, releasing all remaining units from their oath. He called it a matter of conscience. The next morning, with his army gone, he walked into a patch of woods near Duisburg, placed his pistol to his temple, and pulled the trigger. His aide, who buried him in a shallow grave, later recorded his last words: "I cannot ask my men to do what I will not. In another war, it might have been a gesture of honor. Here, it was the last act of a man outlived by his profession." By the time the Ruhr operation officially ended on April 21st, there were no organized German forces left to fight. Factories that had once built the Reich's weapons now housed American supply depots. The industrial heart of Germany beat again, this time for the enemy. Eisenhower's staff calculated the outcome in sterile numbers. American casualties, 12,000. German, roughly the same but 500,000 captured. A ratio that defied every rule of warfare. But rules no longer applied. They belonged to an older age, one in which war was still human. The aftermath left military historians speechless. There had been no great battle, no decisive blow. Just the slow, inevitable realization that one side had ceased to exist before it had been destroyed. General Omar Bradley later wrote, "The German soldier died standing, but his purpose died sitting." It was a poetic way of describing an industrial truth. The Ruhr Pocket was the first time in history that an army surrendered not because it was beaten, but because it was rendered obsolete. And so the curtain fell, not with explosions, but with paperwork. Forms filled out, weapons stacked, names recorded, trucks rumbling east and west. In the silence that followed, both sides seemed unsure what had really happened. The Americans had not fought the heroic battle they expected. The Germans had not suffered the annihilation they feared. What they had witnessed was something new, the birth of a system so complete that it had replaced war itself. When the Ruhr Pocket finally went silent, the war in Western Europe effectively ended. Berlin would fall 2 weeks later, but the outcome had already been decided in the valleys of the Rhine not by heroism, but by system. 500,000 men had surrendered without a decisive battle. It was, in Eisenhower's words, a victory achieved through organization rather than destruction. The American general wasn't boasting. He was describing a turning point in human history. For centuries, warfare had been defined by human factors: courage, leadership, chance, and fate. Victories were won by individuals: a brilliant general, a bold maneuver, a desperate stand. But at the Ruhr, none of those mattered. Courage couldn't change the numbers. Genius couldn't outthink the tempo. Chance had been calculated out of existence. War had reached its industrial conclusion, a process so controlled, so systematic, that human will was no longer decisive. Eisenhower's post-war report to the combined chiefs of staff captured it with chilling precision. The Ruhr operation demonstrates that properly applied industrial-age warfare can achieve decisive results with minimal friendly casualties. The key lies in the systematic integration of all combat arms, operating at a tempo that prevents enemy response. To military theorists, this was revelation. To historians, it was prophecy. The Ruhr had shown that, in the modern world, war was no longer a contest of men, it was a contest of systems. In the years that followed, analysts would give it many names: total war, integrated command, systems warfare, network-centric operations. But the essence never changed. The Americans had proved that with enough information, coordination, and tempo, resistance could be made meaningless. In the 20th century, every empire had dreamed of invincibility. At the Ruhr, the United States had discovered its formula. Yet for all its brilliance, the victory carried an emptiness. American officers touring the ruined cities of the Ruhr described a strange absence, not of people, but of purpose. Factories stood silent, their machines intact but ownerless. German soldiers sat behind barbed wire, polite, obedient, grateful even. The spirit of the warrior, that eternal engine of history, had vanished into paperwork and procedure. The system had achieved peace, but at the cost of meaning. Field Marshal Model's suicide became a symbol of that loss. He had represented the old world, the belief that willpower could bend destiny, that a commander's instincts could still turn defeat into survival. In another century, he might have been remembered as a hero. Instead, he became a relic, a man crushed not by the enemy's fire, but by the realization that his art had been made obsolete. His death marked not just the fall of a general, but the death of generalship itself. For the Germans who survived captivity, the Ruhr became an open wound. In POW interviews years later, many still struggled to explain why they surrendered. They spoke of exhaustion, yes, but more often, they spoke of inevitability. One officer summarized it simply: "We discovered we were no longer necessary." That, more than defeat, haunted them. They had lived their lives, believing that discipline, courage, and intelligence were eternal virtues, only to find they were temporary technologies, rendered useless by a better design. For the Americans, the lesson was equally profound. They had mastered efficiency, but in doing so, they had stripped war of its drama. The Ruhr operation offered no moments of heroism, no legendary charges or desperate last stands. It was clean, controlled, inevitable, and that very cleanliness was unsettling. After the war, some US officers quietly wondered if they had crossed a moral threshold, if, in making war efficient, they had also made it inhuman. Colonel Chester Wilmot, a British observer, noted, "It is a strange victory when both sides lose something essential, one side its courage, the other its conscience." Historians now view the Ruhr Pocket as the symbolic end of World War II's old logic. It wasn't the atomic bomb or the fall of Berlin that defined the new age. It was this: an enemy so complete in its organization that it could make 500,000 men surrender before the fight began. It was the moment war stopped being art and became administration. From then on, every major conflict, Korea, Vietnam, the Gulf, the digital battles of the 21st century, would echo the same principle: the side that controls information controls outcome. In April 1945, the Americans didn't just win a battle. They unveiled a future, a world where systems, not soldiers, decide, where courage becomes inefficiency and emotion becomes error. The soldiers who laid down their weapons in the Ruhr didn't surrender to the enemy in front of them. They surrendered to the age that followed them. If you stand today among the ruins of those old factories, you can still feel it, the quiet precision of a moment when history changed gears. The wind hums through rusted machinery. Rails once meant for tanks lie buried in moss, and in that silence, you can almost hear the system breathing, the echo of a machine that made men irrelevant and ended the last war of the human age.